I started playing D&D 25 years ago, and I started because I wandered into a Walden Books frequently because that's where you went to buy books when it was the 80s. They don't have those anymore. That's like saying I went down to the soda fountain to play jacks. It's not a thing anymore. But I went in there, and in the back section, there was this weird section that was unlike anything else, and it had all these bigger format books. They're all these big 8.5 by 11 books, and all these big boxes, and every one of them had this strange, amazing art on the cover. These bright colors and dragons and knights and things like that. And I just thought they were the coolest thing in the world. And I looked at them every time when I went in there for quite a while, and just thought, oh, that's cool. And then I would like to know what that's about. And then eventually one day I just decided to saddle up and went to the counter and said, I want to buy these books. What am I supposed to buy? And a very nice guy at Walden Books who happened to actually play D&D, lucky for me, explained, you need this book and this book, which was like a player's handbook and a DMG or whatever, and gave me those books and sent me on my merry way. And then I started reading them. And thus began the next 2+ decades of playing RPGs. From there, it went into everything else I could get my hands on. So this was all the early 90s. So this is right as we get to the sort of revolution of a lot of other games coming out that changed the paradigm. So things like Rifts and Vampire, and then you still had, at that time, it had already come out, you had Shadowrun and Mech Warrior and everything like that. So more or less anything I could get my hands on, I was interested in and wanted to play. And for about, I don't know, for a while, like 15 years, that was good enough. And I just played them, and I even remember having a conversation with a friend of mine one day when he said he wanted to change a bunch of rules in D&D, and I was like, why? It's good enough. You don't need to do work with that stuff, just play it. But like all gateway drugs, eventually you have to move on. And so that happened 10 years ago, when I realized that I wasn't happy with the games that were out there for a particular thing I wanted to do, which was play a sort of near future cyberpunky type of game, although I don't like that term for different reasons that I won't go into because we will be here for about another hour if I go into detail at that level. So instead, I'll just say I wanted to play a near future cyberpunk game, but I wasn't happy with anything that was on the market. So a friend of mine and myself, on a very long road trip traveling around the United States, sketched out the entire idea for a game. When I got home, I looked into it, and I found out that there was this thing called the OGL, the Open Game License, which lets you publish under D20 rules. And so I wrote my first game. It was not a great game. In fact, it was probably a pretty bad game, as a matter of fact. But that's okay. I still wrote a game, and it told me I could do it. And like anything, you have to keep doing it and keep practicing with it. And now, 10 years on, I've designed a lot of games and written a lot of books, and it's something that I'm very passionate about and love. I get off work and go sit down and do more work writing games because the reality is it doesn't feel like that. Spending hours designing page after page of fantastical worlds to explore and stories to tell is the farthest thing from actual work I can possibly imagine. Here's what makes NGS different. I don't know if I'd say than any other game on the market. I'm not really concerned with being any other different than every or any other game. I don't know if that's possible. There's such a wide selection of wonderful games, and really every one of them brings something unique and fun to the table. I'm more concerned with what are the things about NGS that make it fun for me, that I think you'll enjoy when you play it. And I think that's very simple. NGS is a rules-light, story-driven, collaborative game. And each of those three things I just said are very important. Rules light and story driven, to me, go hand in hand. Collaborative is just pulling out the nature of what we're doing by sitting down to play an RPG and making it the most important part of the game design. I have no problem with rules-heavy games. I play a lot of them. Most of them I just listed in my early experiences would probably be considered rules-heavy games, and I still play them to this day and have a great time with them. But sometimes I like to pursue a different sort of creative agenda. So I think NGS is the perfect exploration of that concept for this reason. This is a sort of something I had said recently, but I think it's very true. If the rules in a normal RPG are stake, and potatoes and some greens and a dessert and an appetizer, a full meal. And when most people say rules light, what they mean is I'll just have the salad. Okay? When I say rules light, I mean I'll just have a Tic Tac. Okay? I want the rules to be so light of a touch that you don't even notice they're there, that they just fade into the background, and the only thing you focus on with your friends and with the game master is just telling the story. And that's what NGS achieves. Our mechanics are, to say mechanics is more or less a misnomer. Our mechanic is very simple. And the abilities that characters wield and bring to bear in the game are not long, sort of very rulesy text boxes. Instead, they're broad-based, narrative-style abilities that simply tell you how your character meets and overcomes challenges in the world. You know, it could be super strength, it could be necromancy, it could be X-ray vision or the ability to spot flaws in the things around you. It could be that you're an incredible detective and you immediately know when people are lying because you can pick out all the little things about their face. It doesn't matter. It's anything like that. Characters in stories have conflicts, and when they meet those conflicts, they have to overcome them somehow, right? And so they bring some ability to bear to do it. And that's what a narrative ability is. And we're not going to tell you how to use your abilities. We're just going to give you some very broad strokes, some instructions on common ways that protagonists might use these things to overcome challenges, and then let you tell the story with them. If you want to be able to use your abilities in a creative way, that's great. Then it means you're thinking and problem solving, and you're not doing this in the vacuum. That's where that last piece comes in, which is collaborative. You're using these abilities in concert with your friends to make the story an emergent property of all of these things, so that all at once, out of nowhere, you've taken what was just a bunch of sort of disparate abilities, and what's come out of the other side is what's hopefully a very epic story with, successes and failings and wins and losses and all of those things that make good stories great stories. Okay, so what have I done for NGS? Well, I assign the duties. That's the fun part about being the owner and lead designer of the game. So I am the owner of Ventureland Games, and I'm the lead designer on it. But what I will say is, unlike most of the other works I've written, and I've always had help. That's the number one thing I will say. No book or game I've ever written I have done alone. That is simply not possible and probably not advisable. No one man is an island, and if you ever try to do such a massive undertaking as designing a game and you really think that the right way to do it is to design the whole thing from top to bottom yourself, I submit to you that you are simply wrong. Other human beings, just as in NGS, the story is better when you all collaborate and tell it together. So it is with game design. It's exactly the same thing. And with NGS, actually, it was designed with a good friend of mine, which is T.A. Lambert. He's also credited on the cover. He's also our art director, which is not unusual. It's always fun in a small company like ours. You know, everybody gets to wear multiple hats, and that's okay. What I did was work with Mr. Lambert and several others. Our design team's about 9 or 10 people, actually, to put this game together from more or less nothing. It grew out of the idea that I wanted to make a game where people got to play the characters they wanted and tell the stories that they wanted to tell without ever needing to worry about the rules or the mechanics or anything like that. I wanted to try to remove every limitation I could from the story. Because I think an interesting thing about mechanics in a game is that obviously they're never really representing reality. We're always just trying to take a close guess. But the interesting thing about them is that when you then design things like settings or characters or anything you design that's within the construct of that game, you naturally limit yourself to the rules, even if it's not consciously. When you're designing a world and you make a magic system, if you're playing D&D and you're making a new D&D world, you're going to think about the magic of that world through the lens of D&D spells and the nature of their wizards and how they are. You're not going to make wizards that need to eat food and then get real fat, and then only when they're real fat can they cast wizards, and then can they cast magic, and then as they cast magic, they get real skinny until they're eventually bones, and then they've got to go slam turkey legs again to generate magic. That's just not going to be a thing you design. But I could see that sort of thing being a setting. Why not? I mean, if you can imagine it, it seems like it should be able to be a world you explore together with your friends. And that's another strength of NGS. NGS has an amazingly easy and straightforward creation system for settings and for worlds. When we say any world, anytime, we really mean it. One of our updates in the Kickstarter was us releasing actually the audio of designing a world together, designing a setting. And the whole process to go from nothing to a world ready to be played in was about an hour and a half. And it wasn't light or shallow or skeletal or anything like that. That world felt real and involved and deep, and like there were characters that were interesting and compelling that could grok and that you wanted to play. The last thing people said after we were done with it was, I would want to play this, and I would want to play this, and I would want to check this thing out. That tells me you've done what you need. And the thing about it is, when you sit down and actually play the game, you're going to write more of the world. That's what we all do every time we play these games. We write more of the world because your characters do things that tell the ongoing story of that world. You go places, you find things, you explore cities and mountains and space colonies and foreign planets and deep underground and the bottom of the ocean. It doesn't matter. Whatever it is, it's always some part of exploration and discovery. And what you're doing when you do that is writing the story. So it's just a circular process, and that's what NGS allows. You make a setting, you play, you build the world more. You can go back and continue the creation method again for the setting to build even more out, and just over and over again. It happens. What's my favorite setting? There were 4 originally we had planned in the base book. We already have 2 more added through stretch goals in our Kickstarter, and I'm hoping we have 2 more up on the block, as it were, to be added if we meet those stretch goals, and I'm hopeful we will. I think we will. So that's 8 right there, plus our world builders in our Kickstarter can actually add additional settings. We have 6 of those, so there will be more. So this is going to be a very rich book that's going to contain a lot of different worlds for you and your players to explore together. What's my favorite? I really think that my favorite, and keep in mind here, one of these is like a massive fantasy setting that I myself designed and love like my baby. And even given that truth, I don't think I would pick my own. I think my favorite is honestly the Gods Above Us setting. Gods Above Us, it's actually a rather recent setting. We made it specifically for the book. But I'll tell you what I like about it. I think it's a really neat twist on a classic superhero tale. There's a lot of superhero stories that are, sort of done, and we all are familiar with them, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with them. But this is a very fun, interesting take on it, in that it pits, these sorts of like super-powered gods against people who really want to be good and are out there on the street as vigilantes. We've released a preview of it, and I won't go into great detail, but I think it's pretty awesome. The reason that I picked it as my favorite is because I love superhero games on NGS. They work better on NGS than in any game I have personally played. There are a lot of good superhero games. I've played a lot of them, but I love superheroes on NGS, and here's why. I can tell this story in a very weird way. One time in the comics, Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic, needed to solve a problem, but he couldn't figure out how to do it. So, and he's quite brilliant. Anybody knows him. He's a stretchy guy who's also a brilliant scientist. And he solved the problem by making his brain stretch and grow so that the parts of the pathways of his brain he needed to utilize to solve the problem were bigger, and then he was able to think it through. Okay. Now, aside from the hinky science of that, that's probably silly and doesn't work because it takes years to build neural pathways, I love the fact that somebody thought of that and then wrote that down, and they thought of that as a creative solution. That's exactly what NGS allows that you could never do in a heavily mechanized game. Because if I wrote if I was going to sit down and design super stretching or stretchiness or rubber body or whatever it's called, I don't know, that he has, I would never in a million years, if I took 10 pages of 8-point font, I would never think you can stretch your brain to think harder is an ability you get. right? It just would have never occurred to me. And so there would have been this huge list of rules, and when the person came to it, they would have said, well, this is what it can do. I have no solution. But narratively, Reed Richards did this crazy thing. And in NGS, you can too. You can do that crazy thing. Because if you say, I want to use my rubber body ability to stretch my brain and have more neural pathways that deal with problem solving, and then solve the problem, and the GM agrees with you that that would be good, or makes you make a quick check, something like that. It'd be one roll, if anything, then you do. And that crazy story happens. And there's 100,000 more examples like that in comics. And the reason we love comics, but it's hard to make that transition to the game, is because in comics, the solution to the problems that the heroes run up against is whatever the writer happens to think of. Because he can tell the story. In NGS, it's the same thing. You're the author to the story. Just like that comic book author doesn't have to pay attention to rules. Neither do you. You get to tell the story and do what's fun, what's engaging, what's interesting, what's cool, what's exciting, whatever. As long as it's good for the story. When it comes to the game itself, the value sort of proposition, if you will, or what makes it really cool, and the reason why I love this game more than anything else I've ever designed, is because it just does what it's supposed to do really well. It's supposed to be a rules-light collaborative storytelling game, and when you get the book, that's exactly what you're going to have in your hands. You're going to be able to use that game to collaboratively with your friends create new worlds, create engaging characters, and explore stories in those worlds, hopefully in a really deep and compelling way. And beyond that, what I love is how much more than just a role-playing game book that we've written. There are countless thousands of RPG books that just give you their mechanics or a system or something like that and say, here you go, this is what we've written. And you can change stuff if you want, of course, like most people have some kind of rule zero. So knock yourself out. And that's fine. We all have creative license as designers when we play RPGs. But deeper than that, I wanted to really go to the next level with NGS. In the book itself, we have all sorts of just behind-the-scenes things where we show you why we did these things, how to elevate your game, advice for the players on how to make deeper, more engaging characters, how to utilize the very simple mechanics to get really, really, really differing and dynamic and engaging results. How, as a GM, to build tension, how to play to heroes' flaws, how to make heroes lose and villains win in stories without stopping the story, right? So we're really speaking directly to the player, to the GM, to the reader in a more direct way to try to hopefully elevate their experience with the game. So they're not just reading rules and then trying to deploy them, but hopefully they're reading rules, seeing our direct thoughts and the best advice we can give, and then using that guidance to have an amazing experience.